Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Dr. Mahima Nayyar and I am a faculty with the International Family Studies program in Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today we are going to look at the course related to gender and social work, and the module that we are covering is feminist theories. Specifically, we are looking at Marxist feminism. Now, within the framework of Marxist feminism, today we will look at how did the theory of Marx influence feminism, what were the aspects that he covered, because he never talked about women directly, but what were the aspects that he covered about which feminists took up. So the format of the presentation, I will briefly go over that. I will first introduce briefly the theory of Marx. The expectation is that a detailed theory, you have an understanding of Karl Marx theory. Then we will look at the learning outcomes of this particular module. Within the Marxist feminist theory, we will look at the relations of production, relations of reproduction, relations of production and reproduction. So there are different theories which cover all of them. Then we will briefly look at a critique of Marxist feminism, the relationship of Marxist feminism with social work, and go through a brief summarization of the entire module. Now, within the Marxist theory, the male and female roles reflected social expectations which were influenced by realities of economic power, social dominance and cultural authority. Economic power being one of the important words in Marxist theory because it was related to economics. Marx did not talk about women's oppression directly, but his work has provided powerful tools to understand inequality faced by women. Now, Marx himself was influenced by Engels, and Engels' book on the origin of family, property and the state examined the formation of state and the simultaneous shifts in the family. Now, why we need to understand the shifts in the family and what was happening to family is because the position of women changed according to how families were viewed. And therefore, we need to briefly look at Engels' work. Engels talked about the origin of how the origin of private property undermined an egalitarian tribal order, creating families as economic units, inequality of property ownership, and finally exploitative class societies. Women's social position declined as private property gained strength. So what he was talking about is that when there was a communistic kind of trend, then women's positions were stronger, which deteriorated with the coming in of the private property. And then we need to look at further as to say why he was saying that exactly. He said that there was no surplus production and productive resources were owned collectively. So that meant that everybody had an equal share. Husband, wife, dependent children were not a productive unit, nor one for performing housework, nor did they own property, which implies they did not perform any particular economic function as a household. Household as the basic social and economic unit was communistic, which means it was not one family, but it was a community. And all work was done for the household rather than individual members. So there was no one member that they were catering to, but it was different members and it was the entire household. Absence of private property meant that men's productive work and women's household work were of equal social significance. Engels believed that women were transformed from equal members to subordinate wives because of the development of valuable productive resources such as domestication of large animals as private property. Then, private property meant property owned by an individual or by a family where rights to manage it were vested with the owners. Now, transformation of relationships between men and women within the household happened when the property became invested within one family. And instead of working for the entire household, women now started working for their husbands. And their labor became a subordinate part of producing an exchangeable surplus. So what you see was happening was that when the property was communistic, then everybody was working together for a common goal. When private property came in, families became units, and within these units, women started working for one person within the household, that is their husband. They became wards, wives and daughters instead of the adult members of society. Private property made the owner the ruler of the household, and families perpetuated themselves through time by the inheritance of property. So if you see, the inheritance of property usually happened through the male kin, and who became the head of the household. With one particular person becoming the head of the household, the power became invested in that one person, and the others became subordinates. Ways of defining children changed, and women's reproductive labor was also transformed from social to private. So initially when they had children, the children were also a part of the larger social system, they were a part of the community. They were not essential in terms of only carrying the family name forward. But with the origin of family private property, children became units, and they became, the carry-ons of other people's names, which is the fathers. In Angel's view, the historic defeat of the female sex and emergence of patriarchy led to the devaluing of female tasks, roles, responsibilities, and a consequent valorization of male roles and functions. So what he was saying is that all the household related functions and the caregiving functions which women were taking care of became devalued, and earning an income became one of the major tasks. Now, Sachs in 1982 also linked the deterioration of women's status to state formation and decline in centrality of kinship groups. According to her, dismantling of kin group corporations that formed the basis for sister relations undermined women's status further. So what Sachs was saying is that within the community setup, women had a lot of affiliation with other women, and that sisterly kinship was present, which provided support for women. When they became segregated into families which were very different and which were running as individual units, that kind of support went away for women, and they became more dependent on the head of the household, so to say. Now, within the South Asian context also, some of this work related to property has been done by Beena Agarwal, who argued that links between gender, subordination and property related to ownership and control of property. Further, gender equality in legal rights to own property does not guarantee gender equality in actual ownership, nor does ownership guarantee control. So what she is saying is that even if the property is named under the name of a woman, doesn't mean that she controls it. It depends on, the power depends on who controls the property. So for most South Asian women, there are significant barriers to realizing their legal claims in landed property, as well as in exercising control over any land they do get. So if you look at the South Asian context, there are many times when women in matriarchal setups, when women inherit property, they are also married within the families. Like in certain communities in South India, they are married to the uncle. So what happens is that the property remains in the family. The ownership is in the name of the woman, but the property is within the family, and the male uncle will control the usage of the property. Therefore, that doesn't give her the power that is expected. So what she was saying is that it's important to understand who's controlling the property. Now, we briefly looked at what Marx and influences of Marx were talking about property. Let's look at what are we looking at in terms of learning outcomes from this module. Once you are done with this module, you would be able to understand and describe Angel's work on family and property, explain what are relations of production and reproduction, discuss how Marxist feminists have explained gender oppression, discuss the manner in which Marxist feminist theory has impacted the practice of social work. Marxist feminism. Now, Marxist analysis had no place for housewives in the analysis of capitalism. So he never talked about housewives or the labor of housewives. It is Marxist feminism that put housewives into the structure of capitalism. So capitalism was only talking about production and industries and working class and the class which was owning resources. But what was happening to this other caregiving class? There was no mention. So while looking at economics, Marxist feminists brought into this idea that what about the labor of women who were within the household? Now, inequalities created within different institutions, including the family, led to oppression of women. Women were oppressed not just as individuals, but through systems of capitalism and private property. So, any kind of oppression a woman faced, was what they were saying is that we don't need to look at it as a woman facing trouble or facing a certain violence or abuse or oppression, but it is a part of a larger system and what capitalism was doing to the condition of women. Women's rights will be met through a complete restructuring of the current capitalist system, wherein most of the women's labor goes unrecognized. So what they were saying is that there is a need to actually restructure the complete system, because within the current system, women will not be able to get their rights. They said housewives are vital to capitalism. Unpaid work in the home maintains bosses, workers, and reproduces the next generation of bosses and workers and their future wives. So if there is, there's no reproduction or the reproductive factors at home, this fact of mothering is not done, then we will not get the next labor force. So all that needs to be factored into economics as well. They also talked about the care of elders and children. So what was happening is women, housewives specifically, were doing a lot of caregiving work in terms of taking care of children, socialization of children, taking care of the elderly, which is all unpaid and continues to be unpaid in the economy, is not included in the GDPs of most of the countries. And therefore, what they were saying is if it's not, then it is oppressive to women, because there is a lot of work, and if people were going to pay for this work, then a lot of the household income would go into that. Now, women's subordination, they saw it as a function of class oppression maintained like racism because it served the interest of capital and the ruling class. So according to them, it was good for the male member or the household head not to pay the women because it maintained a certain power, and it was good. They did not have to make certain kinds of payment. So that unpaid labor was not and is not respected and continues to oppress women. It divides men against women, privileges working class men relatively within the capitalist system in order to secure their support, and legitimates the capitalist class refusal to pay for the domestic labor assigned unpaid to women. Now we will look at the relations of production. There are different groups of Marxist feminist theorists, and one of them was looking at largely the relations of production. This group of Marxists focused on women's subordination as a result of capitalism. So they were largely talking about workforce related things and what was happening within the labor force. They said women are disadvantaged in the labor market as they are paid less, have fewer options of work, they are employed less continuously than men. So what was happening is, which they say that there is a difference when women do the same functions as men, they are paid much less as compared to men. And there are several studies which have been done, which you can go through. This is just an overview, so we don't cover it in detail here. But a lot of, for the same work, women are being paid much less than men in the labor market. Then in terms of being employed also, women tend to take many more breaks, which also happens. Sometimes they move because within the marital setup that we have, women usually move with their husbands. So if they're moving cities and towns, they move to where their husband is. That means they may have to get a transfer or quit a job, get another one. The aspect of mothering also means more breaks, which means that they're employed less continuously than men. And these breaks are often not counted into the system. Of course, you know that there are different things that are happening now in terms of changes in maternity leaves and laws, but still that means a break, and coming back into work creates certain kinds of difficulties. In addition to this, apart from paid employment, they're also engaged in unpaid domestic work at home. Now, what these people said was that women's labor was largely used as a reserve labor. During the world wars, women were employed, and when they changed, this aspect changed, they were supposed to go back to domestic work. Now, because during the world wars, a lot of men went for the fighting the wars, jobs were created for women. In fact, a lot of the feminist movement started during this time to say that, once women went to work, this pushing them back into the household created difficulties. And that is what happened. So they were used as reserve labor. Again, not being respected for their labor, but because nobody is there, you can come in and work. And once the men come back, go back to the household again, go back to doing unpaid work. That was the issue. Now, housework services in the existing labor force and the fact that it rears future workers and is necessary for capitalism again became a very backward thing. So this is not given any focus, that the fact that they are raising the future workers, because the capitalist society needs future workers. If there are no future workers, then it's a question mark about what's going to happen. If we have only senior citizens and no working population, that can create a problem. But this is not given importance. The work of socialization has not been given enough importance. The other set of Marxist feminists looked at the relations of reproduction. They located women's subordination in relations of reproduction rather than production. So what they were saying is that they did not look at so much as work outside of house, but they were looking at the fact that this role of childcare and producing children and looking after children was leading to oppression. They said this process of exchange became the main reason for women's subordination. What did they mean by this process of women's subordination? They were saying that men's relationship with each other was through women, demanding women as brides and offering their labor in return. So when women were married off, like I said previously, they usually moved to the husband's household. So they became commodities to be exchanged. And these feminists felt that this aspect of exchange was leading to subordination of women. They also said that it led to objectification of women who were reduced to their reproductive worth. So if you look at, in terms of objectification, if a woman is exchanged for certain things or exchanged for children, then what are her physical characteristics? What is she going to? What is the genetic history? All that has also becomes important. Now, children were considered the property of men. Therefore, childbirth became another alienating experience. Now, why this was important is that since children took on the father's name and they were considered the property of the husband's household, even though it was the woman's labor, reproductive labor of producing a child, they did not own the child that they produced, and therefore this whole process of changes in their body, giving birth to another human being, became an alienating process because it was through the demands of others. Now, patriarchy was an old system which existed before private property and monogamy. So according to them, that these feminists actually said that it's not only from the origin of private property. So they took on Angel's arguments and said that, some of what he was saying was right, but it's not that patriarchy and monogamy came in only with angels. According to them, the oppression existed before that also. So this whole aspect of reproduction was the fact which led to their oppression. Exchange of women, abduction, rape were means through which female sexuality was sought to be controlled. So when they're talking about controlling women, they're saying all these aspects were, which were related to reproduction, because even abduction and rape and, what if the women conceived after that, who was the child going to belong to? All these questions led to further control of female sexuality. So, fathers would control the movements of their daughters, because largely the control was because they could give birth to children. And therefore what they were saying is that it is this whole aspect of reproduction which leads to women's subordination and oppression. And this control was gradually institutionalized at several levels. So not just within the family, but also at work, culture, custom, religion, education. Every one of these systems worked to control women. There were some Marxist feminists who tried to combine both these aspects of production and reproduction. Some of the work, one of the works that we'll discuss here is by Christine Delphi. Now, she looked at something specifically where she said that relations within the household are patriarchal and men systematically exploit and benefit from women's labor within a domestic mode of production. She assimilated women's sexuality to the category of exploited labor. So what Delphi was saying is that, she's trying to combine both production and reproduction, and she's looking at women's labor within the household as production, and also saying sexuality, which is one aspect of sexuality and reproduction, which are linked aspects, forms also a part of the exploited labor of women. The unpaid domestic labor of women may have benefited capitalism, but Delphi argued that it was labor that was more immediately exploited by men rather than by the capitalist class. So you can see what she's saying. See, the theorist who talked about relations of production focused on the fact that it's the capitalist society, so maybe industries, organizations, they are benefiting from exploiting women. But what Delphi was saying is actually, yes, their labor is exploited, but it immediately is advantageous to the men of the household, and the capitalist systems of organizations, industries comes later. So the first person to benefit is people within the household, so men within the household. Now, marriage with a man from the capitalist class could raise a woman's standard of living, but does not make her a member of that class. She is not the owner of the means of production. So Marx had spoken about bourgeois society and proletariat, and the fact is, she said that even if a woman from the proletariat or from the a lower socioeconomic background married somebody from a higher socioeconomic background, did not mean that she had progressed or she had got more power. It was just that her standard of living could have changed, but she was still not a powerful person, because she was not the owner of these means of production. So she didn't have the means and resources. Only what the man of the household provided her, she was able to get that. Women's domestic work then became a personal service to the head of the household, who appropriates her whole person and labor. So if you see that her work within the household of cooking, washing, taking care of clothes, running the entire household, managing the budget, having children and rearing them, socialization of children, all that becomes a part of, is in service of the head of the household, not in service of anybody else, but the head of the household, who, as a person and her labor, then owns her completely. And women's work within this household became limitless, because the kind of activities I've listed out, and much more happens within the household. And there was no limit, there was no fixed job description, there was no fixed amount of work, and there was no return for the work done. And that is very important to understand, because household work can be limitless. There are many things that are happening, and women keep working through the day. There is no job description that these are the activities that you have to complete, and once that is done, your work is complete, you get paid. There's nothing like that. You carry on working, and every day the same things come up, things don't finish, because it is a continuous task and it continues to give them no returns. And usually women are seen as not doing any work when they are homemakers. Now, employed women, and what she was further saying is that it happens to women who are only working in the house, but also women who are working women. She said employed women who earn enough to meet their own maintenance cost, but are still expected to do housework. In this case, she is clearly working for nothing. So what she was very strongly stating is that, when women are working within the household, the argument could be that she is not getting in any financial resources to the household. Therefore, if she is contributing in terms of her labor to the household, that's one way of her contribution to the house, because there is no other way in that where she is getting in money. But Delphi also raised the point that even when women are working, it's not that they are exempted from doing work within the household. They are continuing to work within the household as well. Therefore, they are at that point of time, at least you can say that they are working for nothing. The other person who talked about production and reproduction was Juliet Mitchell. She argued that neither of them is solely responsible for exploitation and subordination of women. The social and economic structure that comprises of 4 levels perpetuates male dominance and ensures female submission. These 4 levels are production, reproduction, socialization and sexuality. Now how did she look at these 4 things? Control at the level of production was linked to nature of work and not just sexual division of labor. So what she was saying is that under capitalism, women worked in jobs which were less paid, less technological expertise and were largely in service. For example, secretaries, nurses and so on. So see, there's one aspect that they talked about, that for the same kind of jobs, women got paid less. But the other part is that women were also employed in certain kinds of jobs which were low paying. So those were considered to be the jobs for women. You know, some women, some jobs were marked for men, preference was given to men, and usually in terms of, again, if you look at it, caregiving and managing certain things, secretaries, nurses, and these are lower paid jobs. So you will find more women working in these areas. So that under capitalism, what Mitchell was saying is, led to further subordination. This cycle was maintained by the gendered educational system, wherein most courses for women equip them for service functions only. So what she was saying is that, the kind of vocational opportunities or educational opportunities for women that were available were also for training them into jobs which were not going to be very high paying. So it was going to be service related. They were not given too much business training. So if you looked in previously, not many women made it to engineering colleges, or they would not go in for business training. So things where, they could do their own work, they could go and work at higher positions, which is currently changing, but it's still a struggle. So essentially you will see more female nurses than male nurses, you will see more female secretaries, you will see more female teachers, again jobs which are not very high paying. Now this, when we look at in terms of social work, when we look at this, we also see a similar pattern being replicated in the civil society organizations who run different kinds of vocational training programs for women. We see the patriarchal system being replicated in the courses that they offer. So most of the organizations will offer beauty training, tailoring, again not very highly paid jobs for women. So within a system wherein we are working to make a more equal society, inadvertently as social workers we also reproduce the same patterns when we offer these kind of trainings. Now all these involve long hours of work with low pay. Now what is happening is there is a realization within the civil society organizations also, and by the feminist movement and people who are working in the area of feminist social work, that we are reproducing certain systems, and therefore we need to find out alternative ways of offering vocational opportunities to girls and women. And so some of the organizations are introducing courses on driving or entrepreneurial training so that women can run small shops, they can take some kind of, they can take some kind of agencies and run these shops together so that they earn an income which is substantial. Mitchell also talked about reproduction. She was talking about how reproduction was linked to child rearing and childbearing, in which family was the production side. So see, in the previous slide what I discussed was largely labor related and production related theory of Juliet Mitchell. Here she is coming to this aspect of reproduction and saying how this was a site of oppression. So family became the production site. Socialization, which was one of the main functions of the family, was the sole responsibility of the woman. Sexuality has been subsumed under reproduction, and women have very little control of their sexuality. Control over their sexuality led to many further constraints on women. Control over their movements, their relationships, nature of work they chose. So when you see sexuality is not just linked to who they have relationships with. It's a much further concept, because you see that when you control female sexuality and when rape becomes a very important thing, it becomes a very stigmatizing aspect, families seek to overprotect women. So the kind of job opportunities they can take up, may be curtailed by discussions to say that it may not be safe for you, it involves very long hours. So even if the income is good, but if the hours are long and not enough safety is present, women may not have the opportunity to do that kind of work. So what she was saying is control over sexuality meant control over movement, which again then obviously, if they were going to move a lot, it reduces the mobility, reduces further job opportunities. Again, one restraint on mobility comes in because they are the main socializers of children. So if they are the main caregivers and people who are socializing, then the issue becomes that how can they move? If the job makes needs for them to travel, that becomes another constraint. So all these, narrow down the space for women to work. Each of these affected gender relationships and redefined norms of masculinity and femininity. For her, just entry of women into workforce would not suffice. Women had to be freed from forced childbearing, rearing, and sexually dissatisfying relationships. Now we look at the critique of Marxist feminism. It ignored the displays of agencies of the individual. Women are not just passive receivers of what society provides for them, they are also actively involved in and engaged with systems. But Marxist feminism only focused on what systems did to them and not how they could engage with them. There was an overemphasis on class relations in the economic sphere and which ignored female experiences outside of the labor market. So apart from labor market, there were many other things which were happening which Marxist feminism has not brought about. Now, these criticisms were addressed to a certain extent by the later Marxist feminists, which we have discussed, Delphi and Mitchell, in detail, who have looked at both relations of production and reproduction. So they have tried to look at the labor force and within family what was happening. One of the important things that Marxist feminism did was also influenced another theory which is called as the standpoint theory, which stated that feminist social science should be practiced from the standpoint of women or particular groups of women, as some scholars like Patricia Hill Collins and Dorothy Smith have pointed out. So, some of them were saying that look at black women and study things from their perspective and their standpoint, because that would change the manner in which you look at relations of production, reproduction and what's happening. They also argued that research must be done from the standpoint of those who have less power. Example, the proletariat, as they would bring in a different perspective. Provides an important space and ideology as they view gender relations in terms of class relation. Now, they helped in locating distress faced by women as social issues rather than individual ones. So this is one of the most, when we look at Marxist feminism, that becomes one of the important things. To say that it made problems as a social aspect and not just individual. It entails that problems are within the entire system, and that's what social work studies. Now, social work initially began with casework, but eventually moved to working with systems as well. And within the ambit of Marxist feminism, it brings out the importance of the statement that the personal is political. So there is no individual space as such. The individual is always related to the social and political, and that was the importance of Marxist feminism to social work. Women's oppression had to be understood, located not just within the individual households, but within system. And the feminist approach to social work is based on the assumption that problems of clients are not within the female psyche, but within the societal structure which is patriarchal and oppressive to women. This belief is based on the fact that patriarchal culture, men have advantages which preclude equality for women. And the goal of this perspective is to create a society that is equal for men and women. Marxist philosophy is in tandem with social work philosophy for the issue of person in the environment. So that becomes the importance of Marxist feminism to social work. If you look at what we have done today, basically, briefly I'll summarize this. We looked at the basic theory of Marx and how he talked about economic relations. Then we looked at different theories in terms of, Angel's work we looked at to say how private property led to subordination of women. Based on that, different Marxist feminists talked about how relations of production, which is the capitalist class and the being in the labor force, what did that do to women? And what were the relations of reproduction? So along with, work, what was also happening within the household, the unpaid labor of women within the household in terms of work and also in terms of childbearing and rearing. This module has described how a Marxist perspective helped in understanding position of women as brought about by social relations between men and women, especially within the family, and describes inequalities, how they were created within the family and led to oppression of women. Now, like I've said previously, this is just an overview of the theories, and you need to go through the text that is also present. Go through the additional readings that have been provided to you and the links that are provided to you in the text for a further understanding of Marxist feminism. Thank you for paying attention to the lecture, and I hope you have learned from it today.